Alright, here is where we left our page off from our last lesson. It's basically just content, right? Very little to say in terms of styling. Everything is aligned to the left. Everything starts at the upper left-hand corner of the browser and just works down. Not very exciting. So what we want to do is learn the basics of CSS, or cascading style sheets, to style this stuff. So, to do that, there's lots of things that we can do. Let's go back to this h1 tag that we had. Hello world. Well, remember, we can always create a parameter for a tag in HTML. And that's one way to add a style. In fact, in this h1 tag, if I hit space and just type style equals, now I'm trying to stick with the standard HTML conventions of equals and double quotes. Style equals and then double quotes, I can write CSS in here. So let's try this. Color, colon, red, semicolon. I realize mine went on 2 lines. Let me spread it out and you'll see that that can all be on 1 line. So h1, style equals color, red. Save that and let's refresh. And you can see hello world changed to red. Well, yeehaw, all right. Now, if we went through our entire document and wrote in style equals for every single one of the elements that we wanted to change, it would make this a really lengthy, bloated document where it would be extremely difficult for us to go in and edit it, for instance. So the real way of using CSS is by using an external style sheet. If you recall, in line 6 of our HTML page, we have link, rel equals style sheet, href equals, and then it's blank. Well, we can create a new style sheet, give it a name and a location, that is, save it, and then enter that name and location in this href equals section here. And what that will do is attach a style sheet externally to our HTML file, from which we can write a whole bunch of rules on everything. So that, of course, is what we want to do. I'm going to go File and New, and with this totally blank document, I'm going to save. I'm going to save it as stylesheet.css. Now, of course, I need to make sure I put it in the same folder that I'm putting everything else. Mine's called Intro to HTML. Let me hit Save. Now this file has a location and a name. You can also see that it's listed under our working files now in brackets here. The only other thing we have to do is add the file name in here under href equals. So I believe it's stylesheet.css. Now again, since it's in the same location as our index.html, all we should have to enter is the name of the file. If I save and refresh, I won't see any changes because my style sheet is still blank, right? So maybe we can take this rule that we typed in here, parameter I should say, and get rid of it. And I'm going to show you how we can try to create the same rule in our CSS document. So I've switched over to stylesheet.css. Let's see if we can get this to work. Obviously, the syntax of CSS is different from HTML. But if I write out h1 and then an opening curly bracket, let me just write in a closing one too. That's what we put our rules inside. I'm going to say color, colon, red, semicolon. Once again, spacing does not matter for the most part. So what this is saying is all h1 tags are going to have the rules inside the brackets applied. And right now we just have this one rule, color red. Let me hit save and then refresh. And it looks exactly the same. Now let me point out, I did remove the built-in style right there. That is to say, this line is being used to color that text red. Just to prove that or test it, let's change it to blue. Refresh. There we go. So it's listening. I'll change it back to red. If you're wondering why some of the other text didn't change, well, this is our only H1 tag, right? If we look at our index.html, it opens and closes right there. These are all H2, 3, 4, HRs, paragraph tags, unordered lists, list items. They are not H1 tags. So, to remind you, HTML is a list of instructions. So is CSS. Now, these are appearance instructions, essentially. So what if I wanted to change the colors of all these? Well, I could do the same sort of thing. I could say H2, color red. And if I refresh, this second line changes. Well, let me show you something else. Instead of writing that again, I could have just written H1, comma, H2. And refresh, same thing. In fact, we can keep going. H3, H4, H5, H6. Now remember, the things I'm listing out here are the things that go inside the HTML brackets. There, that worked. Let's try another one. Let's try P, color green. Now, you'll notice I'm writing this out a little bit differently, but it's just as valid because spacing does not matter. What matters is how easy it is for you to read your code. So you can see I have 2 P tags, remember? And there they are. And none of this stuff changed. What if I wanted to change that or this or something like that? Well, let's try it. Those are list items, right? So I could say list item, color. I'm running out of colors already. How about yellow? Let me close that, save it, refresh. Well, that certainly is yellow. Now, what if I only wanted to change the list items in this top list to be yellow, and I wanted the bottom list to be a different color or to remain black or something like that? Well, all we said is LI here, right? What we could say instead is OL space LI. And this would be, if we read it backwards, any list item that occurs inside an unordered list. And now if we refresh, you can see it only changed the ones in the unordered list. If that was confusing, let me give you another example. Here's an unordered list items. I'll set them to be color blue. And you can see that one changes. Okay, so let's expand on this a little bit, huh? I'm going to show you a bunch of other rules that we can play around with. Well, here's all of our rules for the H1 tags. All we've done is say color red. Same with our P tag, color green. Well, let's add a second rule for this P tag. There is no limit to the number of rules you can add to a CSS selector. That's the fancy term for it. So I'm going to say background dash color orange. Save, refresh. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? All we did is say, I want this paragraph to have the background color of orange. Well, look what happened. It made it orange all the way to the end of the browser. How wide is that? How many pixels is that? Well, you'll see it doesn't really matter. No matter how wide or thin I make the browser, this element is occupying the entire width of the document, or at least as much as it can. You see it's got a little bit of a margin there on the right and a little bit of a margin there on the left. The reason for that is because by default, browsers indent or add a margin to your page. Well, you know, that's something we can change as well. I'm going to switch over to our CSS. How would we change the appearance and layout of the entire page? Well, remember, when we write CSS, we are writing, in this case, rules for different HTML tags. You probably remember that the body tag is the one that contains all of the visual information on our page. So based on that, we can write rules for the body to style it. So if I say body background color, purple, let's see if that works. Well, there we go. We have a purple page. Wow, this is becoming an even uglier HTML page now that we are learning CSS, but that's okay. If I remember correctly, what we really wanted to do with this body tag is change the margins built into the browser. So I'm going to go down a line and say margin 0. If we refresh, you can now see that the yellow background, or is it orange, for the p tag is going all the way to the edge of the browser. So there we go. We just said margin 0. By the way, when we say margin 0, that means the top, right, bottom, and left are all 0, or TRBL. Okay? We don't have to worry about that right now. I just wanted to write it out because you can say things like margin dash left, 40 pixels, 50 pixels, something like that. Now look what happens. Everything's scooted in 50 pixels to the left. So to review, this first line says, I want all of the margins, top, right, bottom, left, to be 0. And then immediately after that, we're overwriting a part of that rule and saying, well, the left margin will be 50 pixels. Let me get rid of that rule. Refresh, so we're back to here. Remember, I was pointing out that the background of this paragraph tag seems to extend all the way to the end of the page. Well, that's true. That's because this is recognized as being a block element. Let me go back to my HTML here. This is a paragraph. It is a block level element in HTML. What that means is that it occupies the maximum amount of horizontal space that it can. So what's the opposite of a block level element? Or what's an element that doesn't try to occupy all the horizontal space? Well, I'm going to try to give you a generic version of that, and that would be the span tag. This is a span of text. I'm going to save that. Note that span has to be closed. If I refresh, you can see this is a span of text. Now, let's see if we can change the background color of that. Well, I wonder if you can do this on your own. Give it a shot. I'm going to go ahead and do it too. Okay. When I refresh, you can see that the background ends right with the text. So, what's going on here? Well, let me switch over here. A span is considered an inline element as opposed to a block element. So inline means just take up the amount of space you need. Block means fill the entire screen as much as you can. Now, to further complicate things, we can use CSS to change if something is block or inline. So under my p tag, I can say display inline and hit save. When I refresh, you can see that my paragraphs now have background colors still, but the background is only attached to where the text is. So that's a really brief visual explanation of the difference between a block level and inline element. We're not going to explore those topics too much more in our lesson, but it's important that you know the difference, especially if you're going to go beyond this class and try to teach yourself some additional coding skill. Now there's one other layout technique that I want you to be aware of that's related to block and inline, and that's creating a float. Before we get to that though, I wanted to point out that all of these H tags, H1 through H6, they are also block level elements like the paragraph tag. And if we wanted to change that, we could, in our list of all the heading tags, say display inline. And if we refresh, now they're all trying to show up on the same horizontal line. Okay, so let's get to this float idea. Floats can be a little bit confusing to people. I just want to introduce you to the idea. But essentially, if we wanted text to wrap around this image, let's say, the only way to achieve that is by floating this image to the left or to the right. And what float means, For instance, if we floated this image to the left, it would allow text to come up on the right-hand side of it. If we floated this image to the right, it would allow the text to come up on the left-hand side of it. So essentially what floating something does is push it to either the left or the right of the page and allow other elements to occupy the same horizontal space as it. So it kind of undoes the block of a block level element. It's also a very difficult concept to explain with words, so I'd like to just show you how it works. To do this, we need a paragraph with a bunch of text, because I thought we could put it underneath our tattoo image and see if we can get the text to wrap around that image. So I'm going to create a P tag. We need to plug in a bunch of stuff in here. And let's see, I think the easiest way to do that is by showing you what's called Lorem Ipsum. If I Google Lorem Ipsum, which is basically Latin gibberish, we can end up at this page, or you may have noticed there's a bunch of other pages that do the same thing. All we're doing is generating dummy text. Here's some. Now again, this is in Latin. Latin is a dead language, so this makes it very clear that this page is still a work in progress. If you ever see Latin on a page, it should be an indication to you that they are still working on the content for that page. Well, I plugged this Lorem Ipsum dummy text into a P tag and put it underneath our image. You can see it's showing up here. You'll also see that it has an orange background. That's because, remember, we said in our style sheet all P tags have green text and an orange background, and they display in line. I'm going to get rid of that display inline rule. Actually, you know what? I'm going to get rid of all of these paragraph rules. Save, refresh. Now it looks a little bit more like normal text. Remember, what we wanted to do is take this text and see if we can get it up here, wrap around the image. Logically, you would think you would add a CSS rule to this paragraph to get it to come up here, but that's not how CSS works. For CSS to use a float, we need to float this image to the left to allow the text to come up around it. So let's try that. Remember, img is our image. If I say float left, semicolon, oops, not felt, left, and refresh, let's see if that text comes up. Yep, there's the text. Let's go a little further with this. If we don't like how this image and the text are butting right up against each other, we need a margin in here, right? So here's my image. I'm going to try margin dash right. 20 pixels. There we go. We've got a little bit of room there. So that's a float. Again, you can float to the left or to the right, and you can turn off a float. There's no float center. People often try that, but it doesn't really work. So let's try to take this logic a little bit further. We got the dots to go away on our list, right? But our list is still indented. That's because there's a little bit of style applied to a handful of HTML tags by default. And this indentation is one of those styles. In fact, if this text wasn't indented, it would overlap with its bullet points. All we did is turn off the display of those bullet points, so it's still indented, it seems. Well, how are we going to get the text to scoot back to where we want? Well, we could try something here, but it's not going to work. We could write margin 0, but that's not going to do anything. It's just going to sit there. The reason is, one reason is that we're trying to put this rule on the list items. Well, this entire list is indented. Not just the list items, but picture the unordered list as a whole is indented. And what we need to do is pull it back. What I'm getting at is it's important what you write your rules for, or else they won't work. We need to write rules just for this unordered list, not for the list items inside it. So what can we write to get it over? Well, I'm going to try a few things, but I don't think they'll work. There's a CSS rule for text indent, and we can set that to 0. But I don't believe that's how the space is added. Yeah, that didn't do anything. We played around with margin. We can say margin left 0. That also won't do anything. Why is that? Well, that's a good question. In order to show you, I'd like to add a border around this element. I'm going to write border. 1 pixel solid black semicolon. If we refresh, okay, can you see that border around our unordered list? That's how you add borders to something, but we can use that to add borders to all kinds of stuff. What we're trying to do is get our text to scoot in, right? Well, you can see that the problem is not a margin. There's no problem with the margin here because it's going all the way to the far left-hand side. In fact, I can barely even see that left-handed border. What's happening is a sort of internal margin. That is, inside the UL, there's an indentation. So there's a term for that, or an inner margin, and it is called padding. So we could say padding 0. Or more specifically, we could say padding dash left 0, just like we would say margin left. And if I refresh, you can see that that scoots over. So if I had to summarize that, I would say margin is for external margins, and padding controls internal margins. I encourage you to experiment with adding and changing rules for margin and padding for different elements on the page to see what happens. Okay, there's one other concept that I wanted to introduce everyone to regarding the basics of CSS, and that is the concept of class and ID. Let's take a look at this ordered list with the Red Sox, Yankees, and Blue Jays. Well, all we've done so far to play around with the appearance of this is in our CSS we wrote rules for OLLI and said color yellow. And it worked. But what if we just wanted the Yankees to appear in a different color? How can we specify that, just that second entry? Well, there isn't a way to do it with just writing out the HTML tags that we used, because the HTML tags that we used are list items inside an ordered list, so it would change all 3 of those. What we have to do is differentiate this list item from the others. And the easiest way to do that is by using an ID or a class. And that's a parameter in HTML. So all I would have to say is li class equals, let's see, what do we call our class? I'll call it green, because we can make everything of the class green, green. Now at this point, if I refresh, you'll see there aren't any changes to our page. It's still yellow. All we've done is add the class. We haven't done anything in the CSS to change anything of the class green. I'm going to try that now. So let me go to our style sheet. Now if I just type green and color green, it's still not going to work. The reason being, green is not the name of an HTML tag. To specify that we're trying to use a class here, we have to start with a period. So dot green is the CSS translation of any HTML element of the class green. So my style sheet says dot green, color green. If we refresh, it's green now. So let's talk about what's happening here. This is another area where people can get a little bit confused. What is the purpose of a class? Well, specifically the purpose of a class is to give an HTML element or a series of HTML elements a unique form of identification through which we can write unique style rules. So it's the easiest way of pulling one element out of a list and changing its appearance, for example. There's no limit to the number of classes that you can create on a page, and as I mentioned earlier, you can set lots of things to be the class green. In fact, let me copy class equals green, and I'll insert it into this list item. And when I refresh, you'll see no spaces becomes green because it's of the class green. Now we could write a lot of rules. If we wanted, we could write all kinds of rules for green. We could say color green, background color yellow, and we could keep going and going from there, but I won't. That's getting bright and ugly enough as it is. You might remember I mentioned this other thing called an ID. Well, what the heck is the difference between an ID and a class? Well, that's a good question. Let's see. Here's the Toronto Blue Jays. I can say LID equals orange. You know, maybe we should do something other than a color because I don't want to confuse anyone that way. I'll call it last because it's the last item in this list. So how do I control something with an ID? Well, in a style sheet, instead of doing dot and then the name, we would do hashtag and then the name. Or pound sign, if you are old like me, we used to call that thing the pound sign. So last, what are we going to do with it? Let's see. Background color red. And you can see it changed. So that still doesn't get to the difference between an ID and a class. Well, the difference between an ID and a class in CSS is that a class can be reused many times on a page, whereas an ID is only meant to be used once on a given page. I hope that makes sense. When in doubt, just use class. That's what I do. I start with class, and if I have a reason to use ID instead, I guess I can. From your point of view, it's probably best that you just understand that there are IDs and that there are classes. But for your purposes, you could just use classes through the entire document. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, if I changed hashtag last to dot last, save this document, and went to my index.html page and did the corresponding change. So instead of ID equals last, it's class equals last. Well, I just changed an ID to a class, and you can see as long as I changed it both ways when I refresh, same thing. So that's good. IDs and classes are hands down the best way for you to specify really particular bits of content, like a word or even a letter, and say, I want to change the appearance of that.